Alright, welcome back. We are on our second video of the pause feature for the game. We will wrap everything up in this video. And in our functions tab, this is where we left off. I'm going to close that group up. We are done with it. I'm going to go back over to level 1 and zoom out a little. And we're going to create a new layer to put an effect on. So if we right click in our layers panel and add a layer, I'm going to call this one blur. And what this is going to do is it's going to overlay our viewport. So anything on screen underneath this layer is going to be blurred out very subtly, but still blurred. And then we'll also call on our fade layer at maybe half power and kind of darken it and blur it out. And then we'll have that pause menu that we created in the last video appear on top of that. And what that does is it makes the focus on pause. It changes the look of the game because you have changed something that you're doing in the game when you're playing it. And it's just an added effect to call attention to what is happening at that moment, which in our case is pausing the game. So with that in mind, we got to consider what we want to blur. We created our pause buttons and text on the pause layer, so we don't want to blur that out because when the game is paused, we're going to turn the blur layer on and anything underneath it is going to be blurred. So we don't want it over pause, and I want the HUD, which will have the coin counter and the time counter at the top of the screen. I want that to remain on the screen and for us to be able to see it without it being blurred. So I'm going to drag the blur layer down below the HUD layer. That means the player, the objects, and all our tile maps will be blurred underneath this layer. So in order to get everything blurred, we need to have an object to blur. So I'm going to first close up the text folder, and I'm going to go into our tiles folder. And this tile fade, I'm going to reuse this object, but I'm not going to reuse tile fade. I'm going to clone it. So right click on it and select clone, and then make sure it's selected. And I'm just going to call this tile underscore blur. And then with the blur layer selected and unlocked, let's drag out the tile blur object. And if we zoom in, we're going to use this as a guide right here. So move this into place. It should be slightly bigger than your viewport. You can see the line and the dotted lines. We want it to overlap those lines just a little like that. With our tile blur object selected, I'm going to come over here to the properties and the behaviors. We already have a tween behavior in there because that's what we gave the tile fade object. Our blur object does not need that. So let's go into the behaviors and highlight that tween and just delete it. We should be good with the tiled object here. Everything else we're going to do to the blur layer itself. So make sure that you have the blur layer selected and it shows up in the properties. And we don't want this to move around or be in a different area. We want it to always be overlapping our current viewport wherever the camera is on us. Let's drop our scale rate to 0 and our parallax to 0, 0. We want to make sure that transparent is ticked. And then if we come down here to our effects, let's add a few effects. So edit effects, let's add a new effect. And I'm going to just type in screen up here in the search bar. And we want the screen effect. And it's actually a blend mode. So if we select that right away, I'm going to exit out of this for a second. You can see what has happened. Before, this object overlapped our tile map here that we drew on for the level. As it overlaps anything, you can see right through it. But the object still exists and it's actually still above all of this. So that's how we're going to get this to blur everything below it. We're going to set the blurry effect to this layer, and anything below this object that appears through this object is going to appear blurred. Okay, I'm going to move that back into place. And with our blur layer selected, let's go back to edit effects and let's add one. And I'm going to just type in blur And let's pick blur horizontal. And right away you can see what it does. I like it, but it looks like it's blurred left to right horizontal, which is okay, but I don't want it to just be blurred left and right. So let's add another one. And I'm going to type in blur again and pick blur vertical. So now we're blurred in all directions. So I'm going to exit out of that, and I'm going to leave both of these at 100%, and our blur effect is done. I'm going to go ahead and lock the layer and turn it off so we don't have to see it while we're editing levels. Okay, so that is it for our blur effect. We're going to move on to something else real quick, and then we will come back and work on the code that incorporates the blur. So if we preview this, if you remember from the last video, well, we have the blur turned on right now. We'll take care of that. When we pause, our timer is still going. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that issue. Let's head back over to our main event sheet, and we can drop down our time group. And as I was explaining in the last video, when we added the is playing condition down here, when we made our timer, we checked for the is playing as well, because we only want it to count when we are in a level. But in the last video, I explained how this variable is very specific to whether we're in a level or in a menu or the map. So instead of changing is playing to 0 when we pause, we want to have a different check to see if the game is paused or not. Because as long as we're in a level, no matter what, as long as we're in a level, is playing is going to be true until we die or collect the diamond. But if we pause, we don't want the time to continue counting. So we're going to add another variable to check and make sure if we're paused or not. And we only need to access it when the pause button is on screen. So we can actually put that variable inside the pause button object. So if we go over to our buttons subfolder and click on button pause, over in the properties, we can edit instance variables, and then we're going to add a new instance variable, and I'm just going to call this paused, and it's going to be 0 for false, 1 for true. So exit out of that, and in this same condition right here where is playing is, in this gray area right to the left on my screen, I'm going to double click right there in that area, and that's going to let us pick another condition to check for. And I'm going to go into our sprites folder, our buttons folder, and I'm going to get our button pause because that's where our variable is. And let's scroll down to compare instance variable. There's our instance variable paused, and I want to know when it is equal to 0, meaning it's not paused. So if we are in a level and playing, that's true, and we are not paused, then we can move on to this code. So as soon as this becomes not true, which when paused equals 1, pause will be true, but this condition will not be true anymore. This won't be able to run, and it'll stop counting. But whenever we change it back to 0, is playing will still be 1, and it'll be able to start counting right where it left off. That should fix our time problem, but now we need to know when this paused is set to 0 or 1. So I want to set up some conditions for our time scale. We have two options. The time scale is either going to be set to 0 or 1. So I'm going to add an event to pause. I'm going to go into System, and I want to compare two values. So let's choose that. The first value, I want to know what our time scale is currently at. So we'll type in the time scale expression, and I want to know when it is equal to 0, which is our paused. So when time scale equals 0, I want to set our paused instance variable to true. So add an action, go into our sprites, buttons, button pause, and go down to set value under instance variables. And we want paused, and we want to set that value to 1. So now I want to be able to know that when we press the pause button again and the time scale goes to 1, I want to be able to set this back to false. So instead of checking the time scale specifically for 1, I'm going to just check to see as long as it's not 0. Add an event to pause, go to System, and type in else. then we can copy this. I'm going to highlight it, hold Control, click and drag a copy down, and go into it and change the 1 to a 0. So now, if our time scale is 0, we are paused. If the time scale is anything else, we are not paused. All right, let's set up a few more things here. In our paused state up here, I want that pause layer with all the pause UI that we created to be visible when we're paused. So in this condition, I'm going to add an action, go into our system, and type in layer, and I'm going to find set layer opacity. And the layer is going to be in quotation marks, pause, and the opacity is going to be at 100. And then when we are not paused, which is our else statement, I want this to be 0. So I'm going to do the same thing, Control, click, drag out a copy, down here, go in and change 100 to a 0. So anytime that we are not at timescale 0, we are going to be not paused and the pause layer will not be visible. So none of that stuff will be in our way. Come up to this event and add another action. Let's go into our system and go to our layer opacity again. Set layer opacity, in quotation marks, the blur layer. And the blur layer, when it is paused, we want to be at 100% because that has all our blur effects on it. And then if we Control, click, drag down and copy down to here, we can go into it and change it to a 0 opacity. And then we can go grab our fade tile that we have on our fade layer, and we can use that as well, just to kind of darken the background so that the pause menu kind of pops out. So I'm going to add an action. I'm going to go into our tiles folder, get our tile fade, and then I'm going to set the opacity of the tile fade to, I'm just going to do half, 50%. And then we can Control, click, drag down a copy, go in, and change 50 to 0. All right, let's see what that looks like. Go to level 1 and let's preview. And I'm going to pause. What we have is a blurred background that turned a little bit darker. Our pause menu came up and our time also stopped. And then if I unpause, our time continues and everything else is back to normal. And then one more issue, if I'll do it again, you see whenever we tap the screen, our player jumps because that's the way the code is set up. So let's go ahead and change how that works. If we go over to our controls event sheet and under our player controls group in our subgroup of jumping, we have on any touch start, which means anytime we click on the screen or tap on a touch screen and our player is touching a floor, then we can jump. I'm going to add another condition to this. So in this area to the left of it, I'm going to double click and I'm going to go to our input and get our touch. And I'm going to say, is touching an object? I want to know if we are touching the pause button. Okay, so if we tap the screen, we're on a floor, and we are not touching the pause button, then we can jump. So with this highlighted, press I on the keyboard, and that will put this red X there, and that just inverts it. So now we tap on the screen, our player's on the floor, and wherever we tapped was not the pause button, then we can jump. But if we do tap on the screen and it is the pause button, this is not going to be true. Our player won't jump. So back on level 1, I'm going to play that. And there we go. We did not jump. No jumping. All right. So we fixed that. One more thing I want to do with the pause button before we move on. I'm going to look at this one more time and show you what it is I am about to talk about. When I hit the pause button, if you look at the pause button, that fade layer is above our HUD layer, which is where our pause button is. And when I unpause, it's brighter. So I want to do a couple of things. One, I want to make the pause button a little bit transparent when we're playing the game and it's unpaused. And then whenever we pause the game, I want this pause button to be fully opaque and not see-through, but I also want it to not be covered by the fade layer that we have at 50%. So let's exit out of that. Let's go into our main event sheet in our pause menu, and in our timescale 0 event, I'm going to add an action, and I'm going to go grab our sprites, buttons, pause button, and I'm going to set the opacity to, I'm just going to say 40%. This is actually backwards. This needs to be down here. So drag it below our set pause to 0 action, and then we want to set opacity to 40 when we are not paused. So then with that highlighted, I'm going to control click and drag up a copy up to here, and I'm going to set the opacity to 100. So we still have the issue of the pause button being on the HUD layer, which is below the fade layer, which we set to 50%. So when we are paused, I want to change which layer our pause button is on. And I'm going to change it to the pause layer because it's going to be above the fade layer. So in our timescale 0, when we are paused, let's add an action, go find our button object, and all the way down at the bottom, we have move to layer. Let's select that, and I want to move it to, in quotation marks, the pause layer. And we can move this up to the second action. And then I'm going to control click and drag a copy down. And we're going to go into it and we're going to change it back to the HUD layer, in quotation marks. When we pause the game, our timescale is 0. We will move the pause button above the fade layer and set it to 100% opacity. And then when we unpause the game and we're playing the level, we will move it back down to the HUD and it'll be at 40% opacity. So let's test that out real quick. And right away, you could see it is transparent. And then when we pause, it is on top. It is a bright white color, very easy to see. And then it goes back down. Okay, success. So now we need to give these buttons some functionality. So let's exit out of that. So let's select this block of code here, and then we can right click on it and go to add sub-event. And I want to go into our input folder, grab our touch, and say on tap object, and we will choose, how about button pause quit. All right. And then let's right click and do the same thing again, add a sub event. We will again go to input, touch, on tap object, and choose button pause continue. So when our timescale has been set to 0 and we're paused, then only these two have the possibility of happening, because otherwise this does not have any sub-events and these won't be checked. If we press the quit button, we go out of the level and now we decide where we want to go. I'm going to send it back to the map layer. So if we quit out of a level, it's going to take the player right back to the map where they can either quit out of the map or they can select another layer or start the layer over or the level over. So let's add an action, go to System and say go to Layout. And that layout is going to be the map. And another thing we want to happen is right now our timescale is set to 0, which means the entire game is paused. If I press the quit button, it goes to the map. The game is still going to be paused, meaning none of our animations are going to be moving. Everything we set up is just going to be frozen. So before we go to the map, I want to set the timescale back to full speed. So let's add an action, go to System, let's find our set time scale, and I'm just going to set it back to 1. I'm not going to do any of the math we did up here because this is a separate event. I just want to know that it goes back to full speed, and I'm going to slide that above our go to map. And then when we press continue, I also want our timescale to go back to full speed. So we can really just highlight this and copy it. So now when we pause the game, all this stuff occurs. We have our buttons. If we quit, we set the timescale back to full speed and then go to the map. But if we continue instead, it's just going to set the timescale back to 1, which means the timescale is no longer 0. And if the timescale is anything other than 0, it's going to run this code and get us out of our paused state. All right, let's go ahead and test that out. And we pause. And if I hit play, we continue. And we also jump. So we will need to take care of that. I'm going to retry, and we'll try the quit button. I pause, I quit, and there we go. We go back to the map, and we can select the layer again, and our play. Okay, so let's exit out of that. So we could do this one of two ways. We could add another check here to make sure that we weren't pressing on the continue. However, I want the continue button and the pause button to both be able to set the timescale back to unpaused. So I think the better option we have is over in our controls, in our jumping, we're going to make this block of code a sub-event to another check. So if we add an event, and let's go find our pause button. In our sprites, buttons, our pause button, and I want to check for that instance variable. So let's compare the instance variable, and let's just say that as long as we are not paused, which we'll check this instance variable to make sure that it's 0, then we can jump. But if we are paused, then doing any of this stuff will not happen. So if we just highlight this whole block and move it down below and then indent it, just move it over to the right, and then it will be indented, and that makes it a sub-event. So as long as we are not paused, then we can check all these and jump. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to jump at all. Let's go into level 1. I'm going to check that out one more time. And I will pause, I will play, and we don't jump. All right, I pause, I unpause, I pause, I do it that way. So both the pause button and the play button send us back to unpaused, and quit takes us out of the game. All right, so that is the pause feature for this game. From this point, we are going to implement an options menu into our game. And that will be another one that takes up a few separate videos, but it gives us plenty of options to work with. So that will be in the next video. I will see you there, and don't forget to save.